The thing about burning down a palace is, you don't get to act surprised when the ashes chase you into every room you enter. He thought he had escaped it. The headlines, the sneers, the public's suspicious gaze. He thought he had finally broken the cycle. But he hadn't, he'd only moved it. And tonight, under the blinding white light of a studio built for takedowns, disguised as comedy, Prince Harry found out exactly what happens when you carry a crown-shaped target on your back into enemy territory. This wasn't going to be an interview. This was going to be a reckoning. He thought he was walking into a safe space, a desk, a chair, some banter, a host he admired. But safety is a lie. People sell themselves when they're tired of surviving. He should have known better. The world doesn't forgive princes who choose to become men, especially not the kind who refuse to stay silent about what went on behind palace doors, especially not in front of someone like Jon Stewart. What, Stewart? Saw wasn't a man seeking peace. He saw a brand, a walking contradiction, wrapped in royal linen and Californian clarity. And what he did next wasn't comedy. It was demolition. He didn't ask questions. He set traps. And Harry, maybe because he was tired, he still believed people would meet him halfway, walked into every single one. It started with the grin, that tight, sly, devastating grin that always preceded Jon's most merciless punchlines, the kind that made politicians squirm and media executives blink too hard, the kind that said, "I already know how this ends, and you won't like it. Bye." The time Jon welcomed Harry with a theatrical bow and a smirk dripping in irony. Something in the room shifted. The lights got a little colder. The laughs from the crew lost their warmth. And the silence between questions started growing teeth. They talked about the book. Of course they did. The memoir that had turned every living royal into a headline, and every dead one into an anecdote. The book that promised truth but delivered blood. Jon leaned into it with surgical glee. Not as a comedian, not even as a journalist, but as a man who smelled hypocrisy and refused to let it go unpunished. Harry tried. He really did. He smiled the way he'd been taught. Spoke in the calm, clipped tone, perfected by years of palace polish and PR coaching. But this wasn't a palace. This was a battlefield. And Stewart wasn't interested in diplomacy. He was hunting something raw, something unguarded. And Harry, for all his rehearsed restraint, still hadn't learned how to survive without a script. When Jon mocked the memoir's profits, when he twisted setting the record straight into selling the record for millions, Harry's mask cracked. Just for a second, but in this room, 1 second was all it took. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The audience laughed, but the laughter was thinner now, like it knew it was part of something darker. And Harry clenched his jaw. You could see it happening, that internal war between royal decorum and wounded pride, between the polished prince and the grieving son. He wanted to defend himself, but every defense sounded like a confession. Every attempt at dignity only deepened the impression of privilege. And Jon knew it. God, he knew it. He pushed harder. He brought up the family. The private conversations made public. The bald spot passages, the bathroom confessions. Camilla, William, Charles. All of them dragged into the spotlight again by Harry's own hand. He didn't say it cruelly. That was the genius. He said it as if he was giving Harry a chance to explain himself. A rope, not a noose, but the rope tightened with every sentence. And Harry, blinking, gripping the chair arms, glancing at the camera as if someone might intervene, walked straight into it. He talked about silence, about years of being scapegoated, about trauma, and media manipulation. And it was honest, maybe even true. But Stewart didn't blink. "You've never been silenced a day in your life," he said. And the way he said it, not loud, not aggressive, just tired, made it hit harder than any scream. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room, including Harry, felt the floor drop. He tried to pivot. Mental health, Afghanistan, his mother. But each point only gave Stewart more ammunition. Because what do you say to a man who's spent his life mocking the powerful? For a living, what defense do you offer when your trauma's been packaged, sold, and rebranded as altruism? Harry started unraveling, not theatrically, not in a tabloid meltdown kind of way, but in those small human ways that only the unforgiving lens of HD television can catch. The slight tremor in his fingers, the way his leg wouldn't stop bouncing, the breath that got caught in his throat halfway through a sentence. He was losing control of the room, of the narrative, of himself. And Stewart didn't let up. He questioned the contradiction. The man who left for privacy, yet did interviews, books, documentaries. The man who said he was protecting his family by exposing theirs. The man who preached healing while detonating bridges. And it didn't matter that Harry tried to explain the difference. It didn't matter that he believed it, because in Stewart's hands, belief wasn't enough. It had to be earned. And Harry, for all his sincerity, hadn't earned it. By the 15-minute mark, it stopped being an interview. It was something else, a public dissection, a morality play, a televised therapy session with a therapist replaced by a wolf in late-night clothing. The studio was silent. Phones were out. Producers were sweating behind the glass. And Harry, once the Golden Prince, now just a man caught in the headlights, looked like he couldn't breathe. He stood. He paced. He raised his voice. Not in arrogance, but desperation. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to survive. But every word he spoke dug the hole deeper. "You don't understand," he said. "They wouldn't let us leave quietly. They used us. They lied." And maybe all of that was true, but Jon's reply was merciless. "So you did the same thing, but for money." And that was it. That was the pivot, the turn. The moment the audience gasped, not because of what Harry said, but because of how Stewart said it. Calm, cold, convicted, no punchline. Just truth sharpened to a knife's edge. Harry faltered, his voice wavered. He said he didn't choose the circus, but the room no longer cared about what he didn't choose. It only cared about what he did. He wrote the book. He signed the Netflix deal. He walked into this studio, and now the crowd that once saw him as a wounded prince saw something else. Not a villain, but not a hero either. Just a man, flawed, complicated, and maybe, just maybe, dangerously unaware of the damage he'd done. The confrontation moved to family. Stewart asked him about his children, about the future they'd inherit, about the pages they'd one day read, pages filled with stories they never consented to, written by a father who said he was protecting them. Harry didn't answer right away, and in that silence, you could feel it. Something broke. Maybe it was the illusion. Maybe it was the defense. Maybe it was Harry himself. He said he'd never thought of it that way, and Jon, to his credit, or maybe his damnation, didn't gloat. He just nodded, gave him space. But the damage was already done, because once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. Once you admit there's a part of you that might be wrong, might have been selfish, short-sighted, cruel, you lose the ability to hide behind righteousness. And in that moment, Harry had nothing left to hide behind. He tried to recover. He pushed back, accused Stewart of cruelty, called the interview a trap, a character assassination. But the worst part wasn't that Stewart denied it. It was that he agreed. "I'm using your own words," he said. "If that feels like assassination, maybe the problem is your character." Harry's face went pale. The laughter had stopped. Long ago, the tension had turned nuclear. And as the studio lights bore down on him like judgment, he realized this wasn't going to end with applause. It was going to end with him exposed, bruised, and alone. And that was only the beginning. They cut to commercial not because they wanted to, because they had to. The booth was melting. The producer's hand hovered over the mute button like it was a detonator. Every segment note had been abandoned. The clock was irrelevant now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a live autopsy. Harry didn't move. His hands were still on the desk. His face carefully composed just 20 minutes earlier. Now held the hollow geometry of a man who'd heard his worst thoughts spoken out loud by someone else, and not just spoken, WEAPONIZED. Jon Stewart sipped his water. Not smug, not sorry, just still. The predator had fed. There was no victory in it, but there was no remorse either. The audience didn't talk during the break. Not really. Nervous murmurs, disbelieving glances. Some weren't sure if this was still a comedy show. Some weren't sure it ever was. One person whispered, "Is he okay?" And no one answered, because no one knew. The cameras came back. Up, Harry straightened. The man who'd walked in was gone now. What remained was something ... heavier, not defeated, but something close. Jon spoke first. Not a joke, not a jab, just a question. Quiet. Why are you still here? Harry blinked. The question wasn't rhetorical. You've got money, family, freedom. You're not under contract to the palace anymore. Not to me, not to this show. So why keep walking into rooms like this? Why keep bleeding in public and calling it therapy? Harry inhaled, slow, deliberate, like the question had knocked something loose in his chest, because silence didn't. Save my mother. The words landed like shrapnel. Sudden, personal, not rehearsed. Jon didn't move. I spent 20 years watching her memory dragged through tabloids by men who never met her. 20 years of people pretending she was complicated, when what she really was hunted. A pause, I thought. If I told the truth, it would stop. Jon finally leaned forward, not adversarial, curious, and has it? Harry looked down. No. That answer, that honest, empty syllable, hung in the air, like a verdict. Jon tapped his pen once against the desk. No rhythm, just sound. We're raised in a lie, he said. I get it. Royalty's just a cult with better lighting. But you left, you got out. And then you came here. And instead of building something new, you kept digging through the wreckage of what broke. You. Harry's eyes didn't leave him. You call it wreckage. I call it home. Jon didn't smirk. He didn't need to. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was post-mortem. You dragged your brother into this, your father, your stepmother, pages, and pages of pain. Some of it yours, some of it not. And when they stayed silent, you called it cruelty. But what if it was mercy? What if silence was the one gift they still had left to give you? Harry's throat moved, but no sound came out. Jon continued. You say you were never allowed to be human, that you were raised as an image, not a boy. But that's not just royalty, that's trauma, that's show business, that's this room. And if you want to heal, really heal, you have to stop narrating your wounds like they're content. The line could have been cruel. It WASN. Single quotes, it was quiet, tired, like it cost something to say, and still, Harry didn't flinch. I'm not trying to be content, he said. I'm trying to be free. Jon nodded, almost respectful. So, what does freedom look like to a man who's never had to earn it? That landed, not because it was cruel, because it was true, and Harry felt it. There was a version of him, younger, angrier, royal, that would have exploded at that. Would have accused Stewart of classism, ignorance, bias, but that version had been buried under years of grief and 1,000 headlines. This version just absorbed it. He exhaled. It looks like this. He said this. Harry nodded, being hated, being misunderstood. Saying it anyway, Jon sat back. You ever think you're addicted to the outrage? Harry blinked. Sometimes, I think the outrage is addicted to me. And suddenly, Stewart smiled. Not mocking, not bitter, just impressed. There it was. The fight, not rehearsed, not PR massaged. Just Harry, unfiltered, tired, raw, and maybe finally. Telling the truth, not because he needed to be right, but because he didn't know how to be silent anymore. The silence between them grew softer, and then Stewart, of all people, broke. It was something unexpected. I lost my dad in a hospital hallway. Cancer. No press, no palace. Just silence. Harry looked up. I envied people like you. Not for the castles, but for the cameras. The idea that if you screamed loud enough, someone had to listen. Harry didn't speak. Grief doesn't make you wise, Jon said. It makes you loud. And if you're not careful, the echo becomes the only voice you trust. Another beat. Harry closed his eyes. Not to cry, just to breathe. I didn't come here to be forgiven. I know, I came here to be seen. Jon nodded. Then, let's make sure you're worth looking at. It could have been a punchline. It wasn't. The final segment ran long. The network let it no jokes, no monologue. Just two men staring at the wreckage of fame and family. Asking each other what the hell they were supposed to do now. And when the cameras finally cut, when the lights dimmed and the crew stood frozen, in place, Harry reached across the desk, offered his hand. Jon took it. No applause, just contact, just something real. Outside the studio, the internet exploded. Clips, reels, think pieces, rage. Half called it a crucifixion. The other half called it accountability. but neither side understood what had actually happened in that room. They'd both bled, just differently. Harry left without a security escort. No car waiting, just a hoodie, a cap, and the weight of everything he didn't say. Stewart stayed behind, alone in the studio, staring at the empty chair across from him. He'd broken something that night. Maybe someone, and somehow, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like warning. Asterisk, asterisk, it came at 3:47 a.m. Los Angeles. Time, the kind of hour where even ghosts sleep. The kind of hour where silence gets loud, and every vibration feels like an omen. Harry was awake, not because he wanted to be, because he couldn't not be. The interview had aired 36 hours earlier, and the fallout was radioactive. Global headlines. Armchair psychologists, former Palisades, crawling out from beneath press, embargoes with carefully sharpened concerns. But louder than all of it, louder than Twitter, than pundits, than even the walls closing in, was his own voice, replaying over and over in his skull. You've never been silenced a day in your life. If that feels like assassination, maybe. The problem is your character. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't move without feeling like his body was still in that chair, in that studio, under that glare. There are interviews that end when the cameras cut. This wasn't one of them. This was one that kept eating, and then the phone rang. Unknown number, he answered anyway, because something in his gut, some ancient royal animal instinct, told him this wasn't a prank. This was a shift. A voice came through the line. Calm, familiar. But unexpected. It wasn't Jon. It was William. No titles, no greetings, just breath. And then, what the hell are you doing? Harry didn't respond. Because what do you say to the brother who helped you bury your mother, and then became a stranger? They hadn't spoken directly in over a year. Not since the coronation snub, not since the sources close to the family leaks, not since the truth had been weaponized and monetized and thrown across oceans, but now the silence was broken, and not with diplomacy. With rage. William's voice wasn't the one Harry remembered. It had changed, hardened, refined, not by duty, but by years of bearing the crown's emotional dead weight. He didn't ask if Harry was okay. He didn't ask what had happened. He knew. Everyone knew. You sat there, William said, and let a man dissect our family like we were specimens. You called that honesty. Harry stayed quiet. Was it worth it? William asked. Silence. Was the truth worth setting the whole house on fire? Harry finally spoke. I didn't light the match. I just stopped pretending the house wasn't already burning. The line crackled. Not technically, spiritually. William wasn't just furious. He was betrayed. You think you're free now? He asked. You think America will love you once the trauma stops trending? You're not a phoenix, Harry. You're a cautionary tale. And then, the silence. Not the pause of a sibling trying to choose their words. The silence of a man realizing they no longer recognize the person on the other end of the line. You've become exactly what they made us fear, William said. A story. The call ended without goodbye, and Harry, for the first time since the interview, felt something strange. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. He wasn't fighting a brother anymore. He was fighting a myth. The myth of the monarchy. Of blood as destiny. Of silence as nobility. Of pain as currency. And the myth was winning across the world. In a different time zone, Jon Stewart sat in his office watching the playback. Not the broadcast version, the raw feed. Unedited, long takes, no studio polish, and he didn't look triumphant. He looked wrecked. There's a cost to truth, a price for clarity, and that night, Stewart paid his own version, not in ratings, not in backlash, in reflection. Because there was a moment, one the cameras didn't catch, when Harry looked at him like a man asking for rescue, not interrogation, and Jon hadn't flinched. He'd kept pressing, because that's what the job demanded. But what happens when the job breaks someone? What happens when the truth becomes a weapon too heavy to hold? Stewart's phone lit up. A text from a journalist friend was that journalism, or cruelty, he didn't answer. Because he didn't know, and neither did Harry. The days after the interview were a study in disintegration. Royal commentators circled like sharks. Excerpts from the interview went viral with zero context. Memes, reaction videos, TikToks calling Harry everything from a victim to a narcissist. to a covert American asset. But beneath the noise was something deeper. People changed the way. They looked at him not because of what he said, because of how much he revealed. There's something unnerving about watching a man bleed on camera and still try to smile. It makes you wonder if the bleeding ever stops, or if he's just learned how to dress the wound for public consumption. Behind closed doors, Netflix executives held emergency meetings. PR firms dropped statements like IV drips. The Sussex camp went dark. No new interviews. Just a silence that felt neither strategic nor peaceful. It felt like recoil. And then, another call. But this time, Harry made it to Stewart. Not for revenge, for something closer to understanding. Because something in him, something he didn't fully trust, still believed in the man who'd cornered him on national television, still believed Stewart meant it. That beneath the jabs and the surgical takedown was someone who actually cared about the answer to one question. Who are you? Really? Jon picked up no hello. Just, I didn't expect to hear from you. Harry didn't apologize. He just asked one thing. Was I wrong? The line was quiet for a long time, and then Stewart said, you weren't wrong to tell the truth. We're wrong to think it would save you. Another silence, and then, do you want to talk? Harry exhaled, not on camera. And just like that, the war shifted from broadcast to private, from myth to man. And somewhere, in the quiet, something started to heal. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to keep going. Because if the crown was the lie, then the conversation might be the only thing real enough to matter anymore. Asterisk, asterisk. There's a truth they never tell you. About royalty, you don't outgrow it. You don't outrun it. You don't even escape it. You inherit it like a bloodstain. You can't scrub out. Like smoke in your lungs years after the fire's been put out. Like a melody stuck in your bones, playing even when the orchestra is long gone. And Prince Harry, no matter how many miles he'd put between himself and the crown, was finding that out the hard way, because the palace wasn't a place, it was a gravity. And it pulls, always. The world had moved on, of course. It always does. A war somewhere, a celebrity divorce, an election cycle chewing up oxygen. The interview faded from front pages and timelines like all things do in the age of content, but not for him, not for him, not for Meghan, not for the children who didn't ask to be symbols in Montecito. The quiet became unbearable. Not the kind of quiet people envy ocean breezes and avocado groves and the soundproof hush of designer.com to see if anything will crawl out from the rubble. Harry walked through their house like a man trying not to wake ghosts. He didn't sleep. Not deeply. Not well, because the damage hadn't come from strangers. It had come from Jon, the man he admired, the man he respected, the man who'd gutted him with surgical calm in front of the world, and then offered him tea off camera. They'd spoken, sure, but no apology could put bones back together after a fall like that. No phone call could erase the moment Harry looked into the lens and realized, this isn't my story anymore. It belongs to them now. To Jon, to the press, to the press, to the public, to everyone with a headline. A reaction video, a stake, the monarchy responded. Of course, not with a statement, with silence. Which, from them, is violence in velvet. Insiders leaked carefully measured concern, not from the king, not from William. From those close, an art they'd perfected long before Harry knew what PR strategy meant. They weren't trying to punish him, they were trying to erase him, and that, somehow, felt worse. Because rage, at least acknowledged, you mattered. But indifference, that was exile. And yet, that exile bred something unexpected clarity. Because once you stop trying to be understood, you start asking harder questions. Like, what part of the pain did I cause? Like, how much of the destruction was necessary? And how much was just vengeance wearing noble clothes? Like, what if they were never going to listen, and I made that their problem and my identity? The questions didn't come with answers. They came with weight, the kind that sits on your chest at 4:13 a.m. and reminds you that confession without consequence isn't healing, it's performance. Jon Stewart, for his part, hadn't moved on either. Not really. The segment had been clipped into 1,000 pieces. Some called it the best interview of his career. Others called it cruel, predatory. Punched down, the reaction was split. polarized, exactly the kind of internet chaos late-night shows dream about. But Jon wasn't dreaming. He was reliving, because every replay showed him the same thing. A man unraveling under his questions. And not theatrically, humanly. And that haunted him more than any rating spike, because for all his satire, Jon knew the truth. People weren't stories, they were consequences. And Harry had become both. Weeks passed, the noise faded, but neither of them forgot. So when Stewart called again, no producers, no handlers, just a number and a pause. The conversation was different. It wasn't about the interview, it was about what came after. Do you regret it? Jon asked. Harry didn't answer for 27 seconds. I regret thinking I was the only one hurting, and that was the shift. Because up until then, both men thought they were on opposite sides. But pain isn't linear, and truth doesn't belong to just one voice. They met again, not on a stage, in a private room. 2 chairs, no cameras. This time, no one was hunting. This time, there were no applause signs. They talked about everything. Mothers, fathers, what it feels like to hold a nation's projection in your chest until it becomes a disease. What it costs to walk away. What it costs to stay, how every decision is a betrayal of someone. Stewart told him a story about when he quit The Daily Show, how people told him he was abandoning them, how he realized the audience didn't want him, they wanted what he meant. And Harry laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was identical. They weren't the same, but they'd both been eaten by machines that wear the skin of love. Then, Stewart said something that stayed with Harry long after the conversation ended. No one leaves clean. You leave honest, or you leave nothing. And Harry realized that's what he was still chasing. Honesty, not the Instagram kind. Not the memoir kind. The kind that costs. The kind that makes you look at your children and admit, I don't have all the answers. But I'll never lie to you about the questions. The next morning, Harry sat alone in the garden. The sun hadn't risen yet. Just that slow, bruised light that bleeds across the horizon when the world's trying to remember how to be beautiful. He thought about his mother. He thought about his father. He thought about William, not as an heir, or a rival, or a headline, but as a boy he used to share cereal with on Saturday mornings before duty became their religion. And he didn't feel angry. He felt tired of trying to win. Tired of carrying the moral scoreboard in his pocket. Tired of being a case study for people who'd never lived what he lived. So he did something strange. He wrote a letter, not to Jon, not to Charles, not even to William, to himself. To the boy who once believed he could be both free and loved. And the letter wasn't long, it said, they'll never understand you. That's not their job. Your job is to live in a way that won't need their forgiveness later. He folded it, put it in a drawer, and finally, for the first time in months, he slept, not peacefully, but truthfully, which sometimes is the best any of us can hope for.